All right. Yay, it's morning. It's Thursday. So you may or may not have noticed that I graded some stuff, about half, and I should finish. I know. It always takes me longer than I think it will. But I tomorrow, yeah, I don't have any official work tomorrow. And I don't think I have any Zoom meetings on Friday. I have soccer in the evening, so I should be able to get it done. Oh, sorry, during the day. I don't know if your pandemic life is like mine, but crud, so many meetings every day that it's just hard to get anything done. So, speaking of getting things done, if you're behind, because I know I said I was a little behind on grading, some of you are way more behind than I am. You got to get caught up because we're halfway through class, a little bit more. If you're not halfway done with your assignments, it's problematic. So let's look at the weekly question and then we'll talk a little bit more about history for the day. That'll be good. Ah, okay, hopefully what I just opened and you see on your screen is weekly question. Oh my goodness, is that what I wanted to do? Maybe someday. All right, so weekly question is explain the shift from artisan to factory worker, discuss factory system, um, what were advantages and disadvantages, who was left out, who benefited, what were some ways in which workers responded. So we'll talk about that today, and then I'll remind you where that is in the textbook. Um, when I was grading, mostly what I graded yesterday was question 7, and I'll go back. I know some of you turned in some late stuff, and I haven't graded question 8 for everybody. I think I've just graded a few. So question 8, but I'll finish up tonight and tomorrow. But question 7, there seemed to be some confusion on the difference between national authority and state authority. And several of you guys were confused, thinking that national authority was really larger states and state authority was smaller states. So national authority would be federal government, like US government, um, and the idea of federal supremacy over state law, which comes later, is the idea that when there's a law from the United States and then a law from the state, and then they conflict, then the federal law always counts. But federal or national authority is the stuff that comes from Washington, D.C. in our era. And then state authority is the stuff that comes from Austin. And they have different levels of decision making. Like federal authority, they control border stuff. And of course, that's been in the news a little bit because the state authorities aren't super excited about how the federal authorities are handling the border stuff. But the federal authority handles border stuff. Should we get in a war, sign a treaty, that sort of thing. Some of the laws they make, a lot of the drug policies made at the federal level, it wouldn't have been back then. They monitor interstate highways. Of course, they wouldn't have done that back then. But anything that is between like different states, if there's an argument between Texas and Oklahoma, then they could intervene in that. So international stuff between states and stuff that involves the entire country. So federal level stuff is that. State level stuff is stuff that is decided in Texas, like how we're going to fund education, what the speed limits are going to be, what the drinking age is going to be, that sort of thing. That sort of thing. All right. So, oh, somebody's trying to get in and I didn't let him in. Seems pretty rude. You're a few minutes late. We shouldn't ban you, right? Okay. So let's look at the stuff for today. So your question is about the factory system and notes. Let's look at notes. All right. And then I remembered like, oh yeah, I was going to make more notes, but I haven't really. So we'll talk about that stuff and we'll try to add some stuff as we go. I think honestly, and this isn't just to justify me not doing the notes, you guys have noticed, and I can tell for a variety of reasons. It's not like you have to go to the bathroom and then you're still on at the end of class or something, because that kind of stuff happens all the time. And I realize that you don't pay attention 100% of the time because no one does. It's okay. But here's a thought. If you are taking notes while I'm talking to you and you've got your book out and you're looking at it, this is going to force you to be more engaged. It makes you pay more attention. So even if you don't think you need to take notes, you taking notes helps you interact with the material a little bit more when we can't really interact with each other as much. I can't just say like, hey, Fred, I know you're not paying attention. So explain to me the factory system. You know how you sometimes embarrass you in class because they didn't think you were paying attention. I'm not, can't, wouldn't probably anyway do that, but you paying attention by taking notes, always good. All right. I feel like we hadn't really talked about these Supreme Court cases, so let's kind of go back to that. And I feel like we talked about all the transportation issues. Sorry for yawning at you. All right. You had the John Marshall question, and I was trying to get you, when you answered the John Marshall question, to point out a couple of things about him. He's the first Supreme Court justice to stay for a while. Typically, they stayed a few years. Maybe we had them go negotiate treaties like the Jay Treaty or something like that. Perhaps do other sorts of negotiations. Maybe advise presidents a little if they were friends with presidents. That's not normally their typical activity. But the Supreme Court wasn't very busy. And so sorry, it wasn't a terribly prestigious job. So people didn't stay for very long. It was kind of dull, I guess, and they didn't have much to do. And people didn't go like, oh, that's really cool, you're Supreme Court justice or the Chief Justice. They just went, what do they do? So the Supreme Court really was not a co-equal branch of the government. It was sort of like, you had Congress and you had the executive branch, and then Supreme Court, we don't care about them. Then John Marshall. Okay, so John Marshall is kind of the end of the Federalist tradition. He's appointed at the last minute. There's been night appointments with John Adams. And then the Federalist Party falls apart during the Madison administration because they come out against the War of 1812, right as we're about to win the War of 1812. So it makes them look unpatriotic, out of touch. Plus, they're also kind of snobby. They say stuff like, well, we're so cool, people should just vote for us, we shouldn't have to campaign. So they don't really campaign. They think they're better than everybody else, and they think people should just vote for them. And they want to withdraw from a war that we're about to win or tie, depending on your perspective. Probably a tie, but it's really kind of a win. So Federalist Party kind of disappears. And you may remember, you may not, the Federalist Party was the one that really wanted a stronger national government. They thought that more national power was good and you could bring power or change throughout the entire country. Although this is not an era where we want to make a lot of change, we may want to make some change. And they're also pretty pro-business in some ways. Okay. All right. So Federalist Party kind of disappears, but John Marshall, who was a Federalist, is on the Supreme Court for about 30 years. So you still see the influence of that Federalist Party sentiment even after the Federalist Party goes away. And if you're wondering, are we ever going to talk about political parties during this era? Yeah, next week. Something to look forward to, right? So John Marshall is going to write the opinion on Marbury versus Madison, which I know we've already talked about. And this is the case that establishes the precedent of judicial review. And that is the main thing the Supreme Court does. And that's, letting somebody in. That is the case that really elevates the Supreme Court to becoming an equal branch because it gives them something big to do. And they're going to do it a lot. That something big is deciding whether federal laws, either how they're written or how they're applied, are constitutional or not. Yeah. Now, they had ruled from time to time on whether state laws were constitutional, but they really hadn't ruled on federal law before Marbury versus Madison. That's 1803, in case you're wondering. And I was getting on to some of you, sorry, it seems sort of harsh, doesn't it? I'm really not good at typing. Did I need to tell you that? You could probably notice. I was getting on to some of you in your work because you never put dates on anything when you talk about stuff. So, do that. And I probably should do that more often as well. So apologies. But dates kind of matter in a history class because like the fact that Marbury versus Madison is first, it's one of the early Supreme Court decisions. It starts to establish the Supreme Court as a stronger brand. And then you're going to see some pushback to that as well. Not so much in this era, but in the Jackson era, we'll definitely talk about that soon as well. But Marbury versus Madison early in the Jefferson administration, or at least middle in the Jefferson administration, gives the Supreme Court more power. And then some of the other cases that this chapter discusses are Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And this is where the state, New Hampshire, decided they wanted to have a state university because other states had them. Like, I don't know, I don't want to say which university might be the state university in Texas, but we'll pretend that it's either the University of Texas or Texas A&M. So New Hampshire's like, we got to have one of those. We really don't want to make one. So let's just take a private college and turn it into the state university. So they picked Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College was not impressed by their choice. And they said, we don't want to be the state university. We want to be Dartmouth College because that's what we are. And so they took them to court and they ended up winning because in their initial contract, when they formed Dartmouth College, it didn't say we're going to be a state university, and the state was not involved in creating that college. So since the state was not a party to the original contract, they couldn't alter the contract. So this ruling shows that business contracts are legally binding and can't be intervened into by the state unless something illegal happened in the initial contract, which it didn't. They weren't a state university. And the court will also recognize the supremacy of federal law over state. I kind of mentioned that when we started, because in McCulloch versus Maryland, McCulloch was the head of the National Bank, and he wanted to, let's see. Okay, they had a branch of the National Bank in Baltimore. And I want to get the story backwards. So they've got the branch of the National Bank in Baltimore, Maryland, and then the state of Maryland says, hey, National Bank of Maryland, of the United States branch in Baltimore, you have a bank on our property, so we're going to charge you state tax. And they went, we're the federal government, we're the national bank, we don't pay state tax. And McCulloch says, he's the head of the bank, says we don't pay state tax. And the state of Maryland says, well, you do now. And so McCulloch took the state of Maryland to court and said, hey, we're the national bank, we're not paying tax. So this was a conflict between the federal government and the state government, and the federal government won. So it sets the precedent, notice precedent. That's kind of one of the cool things the Supreme Court does. So they set a precedent that if there's a conflict between federal law and state law, federal law always wins. Yeah, okay. And if you're wondering, like, why is she going over these court cases? Is this a law class? Is this a government class? Not exactly. Is it possible one of these cases might be on the quiz? Possible. It is possible, isn't it? All right, and then Gibbons versus Ogden will, will show the right of Congress to intervene in interstate commerce. Gibbons and Ogden both received monopolies to run steamship lines on the Hudson River, which is a border between New York and New Jersey. One of them received the monopoly from New York, one from New Jersey. Now, some of you are going like, isn't monopoly illegal? Not yet, not yet. And they weren't even talking about monopoly in this case. They were talking about who got to run their monopoly. So both of these have been granted the monopolies, but by different states. So it's a shared border. Both states asserted they had the right to grant the monopoly. The companies sue each other. The Supreme Court says, hey, Congress makes this decision, not these states, because it's a shared border. So therefore it involves two states. So Congress should make the decision. So it reasserts the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So it says that Congress gets to make this decision rather than the individual states. Okay. So one of the trends you should notice about the Marshall Court is it tends to enhance national authority versus state, and it also tends to recognize the solemnity or the validity of contracts. So it's good for business and it's good for federal government. Yeah, yeah. All right. And one of the things you'll notice too, if you pay attention to the Supreme Court, and honestly, what teenager doesn't, is courts tend to have trends or tendencies within their rulings. So that's sort of the trend or tendency within the Marshall Court. They tend to rule for stronger state power, or excuse me, stronger federal power, and to enhance the power of business and business contracts, that sort of thing. From time to time, you'll notice courts might be more liberal or more conservative. They might be more about business rights. They might be more about individual rights. They might be more about states' rights. And you'll notice as we get closer to the Civil War, surprisingly enough, perhaps to you, the Supreme Court becomes more about states' rights. That's, of course, after Marshall is not the Chief Justice. So that could possibly create a conflict. I feel like it will. But for a long time, because Marshall's there about 30 years, it'll be pretty strongly on the federal side. All right. And I think we mentioned maybe a cult of domesticity last time. And this is a term that's coined by somebody, I can't even remember her name, that's terrible. But she's a historian who writes in the 1980s, I think. And she coins this era, the cult of domesticity. People didn't join it. They didn't call it that back then. They didn't have membership cards or anything. But just the idea that women are supposed to be keepers of the home, that the home should be pure and should keep the influence of the outside world out, except for church, where women should go a lot. So outside world could corrupt women, so it'd be better if women didn't work outside the home. And women are supposed to preserve the moral fabric of society. Now, some of you dudes are probably going, well, that's kind of sexist. Why are they saying men don't know how to behave? Because men don't know how to be, okay, no, that was sexist. I apologize. Why? Because it's pretty common belief during that time period that women were more spiritual. We even had evidence they went to church more often. Historians who are not necessarily religious scholars will sometimes say it's because they died younger, so they want to get close to God sooner because they knew they're going to meet him sooner. At least that was their belief. Also, maybe dudes just want women staying home and out of business for a variety of reasons. Somebody's got to take care of the kids. Maybe they thought their wives cooked better. I don't know. I don't want to say any more stupid stuff. Societal norms during that time period were women did the housework and men did the outside of housework. It's cultural norm, pretty typical, nothing unusual. I'm not saying it was okay. I'm just saying it was normal for that time period. So that's what people did. But it also kind of suggests that if there are any moral failings between men and women, it's almost always the woman's fault because she is supposed to be the keeper of the purity. If the purity is not kept, it's the woman's fault. So you can always blame the woman and say like, hey, that was her job to keep the purity and she failed in her job. So no matter what happened to a woman during this time period, it's pretty much her fault. And some of you are going like, well, that's not cool. That's probably true. That's not cool. All right. But I don't know if that's a good historical judgment. Also, speaking of historical judgments, are you still there? Are you good? Everybody's good? Speaking of historical judgments, a lot of the stuff that I've been reading that you guys are writing says interesting stuff like that guy was stupid, or this guy's thoughts didn't make any sense, or I can't believe how racist he was. Okay. I'm sure you think the guy was stupid and you can't believe it how dumb he is or how racist he is. However, in a history class, what I'd really rather see is stuff that he did or said that you didn't agree with. So it's not that you can't think that he's dumb or racist or ignorant or sexist or whatever it is you think. Show some stuff that he did or she that bothered you rather than just pronouncing them whatever they are, dumb, stupid, racist, sexist, that kind of thing. Even though I know, I just made a sexist comment. So sorry, not trying to have different standards. I know now you're going like, she's a hypocrite, double standard. Wasn't my goal. Sorry. All right. But yeah, in history, we try to show rather than tell, if that makes any sense. So list examples of things that people do that show your point rather than coming to a conclusion like he was racist, he was sexist, he was stupid, that sort of thing. Show dumb stuff he did, or sexist stuff, or racist stuff. All right, or she. I'm not trying to. Yeah. Okay. All right. So factory system. I know. You're saying like, where are those notes? They're not there, are they? Okay. So your question was your weekly question. Let's go back to the weekly question. Weekly question was how, let's say, explain the shift from artisan to factory work, discuss the factory system. What were the advantages and disadvantages? Who was left out? Who benefited? What were some ways in which workers responded? Okay. Sorry, I goofed some stuff up, didn't I? All right, well, I'm trying to go back to where we were. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you guys want to ask? Is there anything you wish I had talked about? No, about the weekly questions. So don't get too distressed. Unless you want to, then get distressed. Who am I to tell you what to do? Okay, so that is the weekly question. I thought I would just slide that in there. It'd be cool if it were kind of the same font. Who does this stuff? All right. So shift from the factory artisan to factory work. I would talk about a couple things, and the book will help you if you go to page 340 to 347. Part of the reason I put those page numbers in there. So the book talks about the factory system, nicely titled The Factory System, and it talks about the fellow Samuel Slater, who emigrates from England, and he invents the mechanized spinning jenny, or invent is probably a kind word. He steals the technology from England. So we'll put Samuel, oops, not there. Samuel Slater. Poop. So you want to talk about Samuel Slater, who immigrates. I don't know how I made it through graduate school and typed 8 million papers and still can't type. Immigrant from England adapts the spinning jenny to a power, what should we say? Adapts the spinning jenny to, let's see, what does your book say? We'll just say adapts a power-driven spinning jenny. How about that? And you're going like, well, that's cool. What does that do? So spinning jenny takes, makes thread essentially and looms it to make cloth. And I don't know, I can't imagine that you ever made thread. I've got a friend who will get wool and then spin it into thread, and it's a very strange thing, I think. You guys probably don't do that, but maybe when you were little kids, you had that little, I don't know, some little plastic thing with loops on the end of it, and you put these little stretchy things on it, and then you loomed the stuff together and you made a pot holder for your grandmother or something like that. It's That's a very basic principle of what it does. But this matters because this enables the creation of textile mills. And if you just copy this and stick this in your answer, I'll know because I wrote this, so I'll recognize it. So textile mills are the first factories. I know I can't spell. I can spell. Are the first factories in the US. And textile mills make cloth, and then you take cloth and you make cloth into clothing. So a textile mill doesn't make clothing, it makes cloth and then cloth into clothing. Now, the book is also going to talk about how they're going to start to, at first there's a boycott of British imports, and then there's going to be a group of people in the Boston area who are going to create a bunch of factories near a river system because the river helps power the motion of the water, paddle wheel, that kind of stuff, powers the spinning jenny and the looms and that sort of thing. So this is going to be known as the Lowell or Waltham system because it's in the Lowell-Waltham area of Massachusetts. I think Lowell was the person, I think it was Robert Lowell, I think. But Waltham is the area. So, and this is in Massachusetts. Now, these were staffed by women. So, all right, so primarily employed unmarried women. And this was not seen as a career. Kind of a gap between when you were not married and when you were married. Okay, so we got unmarried women. They work here, they live in dorms, they have lots and lots of supervision, and the book talks about how this would look really weird to us in the modern era, but it was supposed to protect women. It was sort of their little work cocoon. So the women are always supervised, scrutinized, protected, however you want to look at it. Sometimes the women complained that the wages were low and that the work was hard, but because this wasn't going to be their career, they probably didn't stay for a long time. The book is going to mention that occasionally they would organize strikes or protests against their working conditions. And there's even going to be court cases where it says that that's probably an okay thing to do. Those are going to be court cases on a state level. It doesn't make it to the federal level. So after a while, once we have the large wave of immigrants, and then your book will talk about large waves of immigrants, and the factory system expands in the United States. And the book talks about pork production in Cincinnati, Cincinnati Porkopolis, I believe. So, you know, you don't want to just talk about the textile mills and Samuel Slater and the Waltham system, but, you know, also mention the stuff about the meat cleaning production, that sort of stuff. I really cannot type. And talk about the use of immigrant labor. The thought was, if you use immigrant labor, these guys are really desperate. There's no minimum wage just yet, and people don't like them. The book talks about something called nativism. and we'll mention here, so maybe you'll think about putting that in your answer too. So nativism is this kind of we're better than you, we don't like immigrants sort of feeling. So we have problems of nativism and urbanization. And this leads to some resentment from people born in the US. So the thought is a whole bunch of like 4 million new immigrants are going to cause trouble because a bunch of poor people, at least 3/4 of them, and English may, or our version of English may not be their first language. Not a huge stretch to think that people from Ireland were probably familiar with English, and they may have had some accent or some sort of dialect or something along those lines, but they were probably, you know, they'd certainly heard English before. But there's also that kind of English Irish sentiment where they don't necessarily like each other. So people from the United States may pick up on that. Plus, it's a bunch of dang Catholics, and we don't like Catholics during that time period. But when you get new groups of immigrants in, the assumption is that they're not, well, since they're not from here, they're going to change the culture, they're going to bring down wages, that sort of stuff. And this is an era where there's no minimum wage. Now, that's not the biggest concern yet, because this is the early development of the factory system. So when we've got shift from the artisan to factory worker, part of this is because of the inventions, Samuel Slater, all that. Also, you could mention you could also mention Eli Whitney and interchangeable parts, which will lead to some manufacture of machinery, things like especially guns, that sort of thing. So shift from artisan to factory worker has to do with a lot of stuff. Some of it's that boycott that your book is going to mention in 1807, where we stop importing British goods for a while. And that's all that quasi-war, War of 1812 preview sort of stuff. They're irritating us, so we don't want to import their stuff anymore. So we're going to develop a need for manufacturing. Our population's increasing. So, and we also borrow some of this British technology. So they're going to create the technology to make textile mills. That's going to be the primary factory. Women are going to work there. Who advantages and disadvantages? Think about what can be produced and how quickly it can be produced. Artisan is the person who works at probably in the home or home studio and makes one thing, makes the total thing. You know, they don't just make one part of something, they assemble the entire thing and they make it by hand. So factory work is mass production, factory system is mass production, early version, kind of, it's definitely mechanized, but not in the electrical system that we would imagine today. Advantages and disadvantages, you have the ability to produce more items. Once we really get in gear, the items are probably a higher quality, maybe not at first, but as time goes along and technology improves, it probably is. The artisan crafted things are unique and probably in the initial part of the period higher quality, but as time goes along, probably not so much. But they're more unique, they're going to be more expensive. But if you are the artisan, you really can't sustain this unless you live in a community that values the more expensive, more unique item. And there probably aren't going to be a lot of communities that value that. So this is going to completely change the nature of work. And we're going to start to move away from what most historians would refer to as the putting out system, where you work at your house and maybe you make all the sleeves of a garment and somebody else makes all the bodices of the garment and somebody else makes the collars, and then somebody gathers them up and puts them together. to a factory system where you go to work and you work with machinery and your level of skill is going to decline. When we go from a system where your skill is really important, your individual skill matters, to a system where you're running a machine, you're not going to be as valuable in the system because you're running a machine. The machine's doing the work. I realize you're running it, but it doesn't require as much skill. This also means that you as the worker are going to be more easily replaceable. You as a worker being easily replaceable means that you're not as valuable to your employer because he can get rid of you and get a new person to do the work very quickly. So it mostly benefits people who own the businesses. Now, if you're wondering, can we say that it benefits society? Maybe, because we're producing goods at a higher rate, they're faster, they're probably going to be cheaper eventually, but it's going to create a bunch of new jobs, yay for new jobs, but these are going to be kind of low wage jobs because they don't require as much skill. But we've got a whole bunch of immigrants, so we'll just slide them into the low wage jobs. Now, for a while, we slid the women into the low wage jobs, but that system's not very sustainable either because most people don't think women should be in the workplace. And the workplace they created for these mill girls was an expensive workplace. They made dorms for them. They had activities for them in the evenings so that they would have something wholesome to do. You know that employers aren't going to do that. They're not going to create dorms for their workers to stay in, and they're not going to make sure that they have lectures and concerts and church services. They're just going to give them a cheap job in a factory. Okay. Some of the other disadvantages might be it could be dangerous. The workplace could be dangerous. Who is left out and who benefits? I mean, those are kind of your decisions, and you read through the book and it will help you a little bit as well. Eventually, women are probably not going to do as many of these jobs except poor immigrant women who live in cities. So they're not going to take those kind of upper middle class farm girls and have them work in textile mills for a while. So this doesn't create careers for most people. It creates jobs for a lot of people. So it's going to be low wage, low skill. And some of the ways in which workers responded, you notice some of the mill girls went on strike. There'll be some other folks that will go on strike as well. Some immigrants will go on strike, but you won't see that as often in this era because it's not terribly effective. Now, if you want more specific detail, as you always do, in that section on page 346, where it talks about voices of freedom, it's going to talk about a couple of the mill girls and their responses to their jobs. So one of them is actual mill girl Lowell system from a pretty, successful family. So she's going to talk about what her life is like at work and talks about how their bosses maybe aren't always as polite to them as they pretend to be, and they have 12-hour shifts, and the work is monotonous and it's boring, and it's not, what they expected. And then the other letter is from an Irish immigrant who's going to talk about immigration to the United States and if it's working well for her, and how some things are good and some things are challenging. So I would read through those things and get some ideas about how this worked. Now, again, early factory systems. So this will continue to grow. Now, during this era still, I mean, before the Civil War, most people do not work in factories. But more people who live in cities will work in factories. Still more people live in the country, and we're still mostly a rural country until about 1900, where we kind of get 50-50. So we're a little slow on the development of cities compared to our European friends, but this is going to start to hasten that development. So if you add factory system and you add that to immigration, then you'll start to see the development of this factory system. The next section of the book that I really didn't make good notes about, but I just wanted to point out, Transcendentalism and the Second Great Awakening, and that's on the pages that follow that. There's also this concept of manifest destiny in there. So I would look over the idea of manifest destiny. So the idea of manifest destiny is the idea that God, because we like God a lot during this era, had intended for the people of the United States to continually move west and take over the entire country. So it was a divinely appointed mission. So God wants the US to occupy the entire continent. It's a pretty well accepted idea in the United States by the average person, not by the average Native American. They're not really on board with this idea. Nobody's discussing this with them. But here's how we knew it was true, because it was easy to do. So the thought was, if God didn't want the people of the United States to take over the entire continent, he would have made it harder for them to take over the entire continent. And why would God want us to do this? So we could spread liberty throughout the entire continent, to spread liberty. Yeah. Who doesn't want liberty? Yeah, okay. Transcendentalists are writers from the time period who are going to talk about becoming one with nature and getting to know yourselves and that sort of stuff, transcending nature and transcending societal traditions and institutions. So transcendentalist, let's see if I can even spell this again, transcendentalist favored the individual over the group in some ways. And nature over, I don't know, nature over, I don't know if society is the right word or what, but I'll put that in there. So these are the guys that go, the Walden Pond, they go and live in the middle of the forest. They get away from society and they become one with nature and look for the simplicity of life, that kind of stuff. They also tend to be people with a little bit of means, so they can enjoy the simplicity of life and see it in a different way. I've always had trouble as an English teacher. I was an English teacher for a few years of my high school teaching career. I always had trouble with transcendentalists because they were rich guys, my Ozark impression. They were rich guys who kind of, I don't know, glorified the idea of poverty because it was simple. It's like, yeah, if you live out in the woods by yourself, your life is simple, you just get what you need. And that's true. But if you live out in the woods by yourself forever, you get eaten by a bear or you get sick and you die because there's nobody there to take care of you. So it's cool if you do it for a season, or if you want to protest your taxes because you don't think the Spanish-American War is moral and you want to go to jail for a day or two, that's a lovely protest. Going to jail for many years, I haven't done that, but going to jail for many years is not a protest, and it's not cool, and it's not worth writing essays about. So transcendentalists are interesting people, I think, and they talk quite a bit about how your individual voice needs to be at least critical of common thought, and how getting one with nature kind of helps you transcend the problems of the world and helps you see the world in a different way. And who could argue against that? That part is nice. Okay. And then you also want to realize that the Second Great Awakening is a major religious revival And we'll talk more about this later. And we're talking like 1830s and 40s, probably. I know, bad type. Now, if you're wondering, why do we care about religious revivals? Well, we already talked about the First Great Awakening and how it gave people the idea that they should be more thankful for what they have, but also their individual voices mattered more and they should be more involved in politics, that sort of thing. The Second Great Awakening is probably more profound in some ways. I don't know if that's a fair assessment, historical assessment, but the theological part of the Second Great Awakening is probably a bigger deal in some ways because it's a movement away from predestination and toward free will. And you're going like, well, that's great. So I'll write that in there because you're already so impressed. Away from predestination and toward free will. I know, bad typing. And you're going like, do we really care about this? Maybe, maybe not. But predestination, you may remember, was that idea that God had already determined whether you go into heaven or hell. And part of your task on earth was to figure out which way you were going. And you probably behaved as though you were going to heaven because you were hoping you were going to heaven, but you didn't know. So people who believed in predestination were kind of nervous people. It's like, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going to try to live the right way. So it'll be evidence that I'm headed in the right direction. Free will is the idea that you can accept salvation or not, that it's an individual's choice. So that way, you have a little bit of control over the situation. So free will suggests that the way that they would have seen it is that you can accept Christianity as your belief system, however you would go about doing that. In more liturgical churches, that would mean that you got baptized and confirmed and had first communion and that sort of stuff. Liturgical churches are the ones that have sacraments or those ceremonies. And in more evangelical churches, it would be like, I accepted Jesus, I acknowledge that through baptism, that sort of thing. So they're a little less formal, we'll go with that. But it's the idea that your faith and your belief is what saves you, not whether God chose you or not. So you get a chance to choose God. So this is a much more democratic version of religion. And this is where historians kind of go with this, because I know you're thinking, why are we even talking about this in a history class? Because it impacts US history. Because all these Second Great Awakening folks, they went to these revivals, they heard a bunch of preaching, and they thought, oh my goodness, we've got to apply this to our lives and we've got to change society. So you'll see a bunch of pushes for reforms. So this leads to a push for many reforms, including my favorite reform, prohibition. That's where we make alcohol illegal because no one needs to drink. I know you guys don't because you're under 21, but yeah, alcohol, who needs that stuff? Including prohibition of alcohol, ending prostitution. Do we even want to talk about that? No, we don't. No, I had a history class, a women's history class. Have I told you why you may or may not want to take women's history classes? Young men, this was my impression, I could be wrong, wanted to take women's history classes because they thought, this was, again, my impression, because they thought we'll meet a lot of women. You will, but they didn't take the class to meet you. Typically, it's a little more on the feminist side, but if you take women's history this era, you're going to learn way more than you ever wanted to learn about prostitution. I got to read a book about prostitution when I was about 18 or 19 and not terribly worldly. And I probably learned a lot of stuff that I wasn't quite ready to learn. But there you go. So leads to a push for many reforms, including prohibition of alcohol, ending prostitution, women's rights, and the big one, abolition. So I'll put abolition of slavery in case you're wondering what they want to abolish. These movements are going to be pretty important and powerful. Also, like prison and asylum reform. Asylum is where you put folks with mental health challenges. They would not have seen those as mental health challenges during that time period. And education reform. So really spreading public schools quite a bit during this time period. So Second Great Awakening, which is a religious revival, is going to lead to the development of these reforms. And of course, the most successful and most impactful during this time period is going to be the abolition reform, I think. I think that's it. Yeah, I'm sure of it because I'm the history teacher. Plus, you know, we're going to end slavery relatively soon, historically, and that it might lead to a civil war, even though your 8th grade teacher told you it was states' rights. It is states' rights, but mostly about having slavery. Let's see. So this also leads to the development of new denominations and religious, and we'll say sects, of Christianity. One more try. And the big group that develops, that just one there before, was Mormons, but also evangelical Christian denominations. Not demon, denominations. And I know we probably had our basic talk about religion and Christianity, where there's two big groups of Christians, one being Catholic and one being not Catholic, and the not Catholics are Protestants. This is definitely a Protestant revival. I'm not saying that there weren't Catholic churches that did good things, but this is definitely a Protestant revival. Also, I know I've had some discussions with students who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, yes, the Mormons, and they have told me our church is not Protestant. For our purposes in our class, your church is Protestant, so don't be mad. So the development of the Mormon sect, and the book will also talk about how Mormons were not, we'll say, highly esteemed when they first started. I think, you know, people go like, oh, Mormons are nice. They don't have so much caffeine and they're family oriented. I think, you know, more, I think the general perception of Mormons is fairly positive in the modern era. However, during this time period, not so much. Mormons were driven out of, well, everywhere they were. So that's how they ended up in Utah, because the thought was, we'll just go to Utah, nobody's there. And that's kind of, well, Utah was part of Mexico at the time. So they agreed to become Catholic, as did everyone who went to part of Mexico in that era. The folks who emigrated to Texas did the same. And of course, nobody meant it, except the people who are already Catholic. They probably meant it. Yeah. All right. So I don't know if any of that was helpful or not. I will probably add to this a little bit before my afternoon class, and then I'll repost the notes. I know it's not a huge section of notes, but it might be a little bit helpful as you go through and work on your weekly question. All right, let me double check the rule. I know it's not quite time to go. It's not quite time. Don't be upset. But I'll double check the role and also see if you guys have any questions. So at this point in class, do you guys have any questions? Is there something you want to ask? Does anybody want to ask anything? Okay, I think I should ask you something because I'm always nervous about you guys. Like, are they really there? I know teachers joke about how if they teach elementary school, all the kids are on screen all the time and they're picking their noses and their pets come in the screen and all kinds of weird things happen. and they're always, yelling and screaming and dancing. And then if you teach high school age kids, it's like a seance. It's like, can I hear a voice? I think I hear a voice. Yeah, because you guys don't participate because you're working on your physics or whatever you're doing. Are we really here? It is hard to know, especially in this era of education. It's like, is this real? That sounds like a song from the 80s. Is this real? Is this just fantasy? Or some very interesting philosophy that I remember reading from college. Like, is the temporal world real, or are we all imagining it? I don't think we're imagining this class. I don't know. Maybe we are. Okay. So let me see if there's anything that I want to ask you. Let me look at the book really quick. Yeah, I definitely don't want to ask you any questions about religion, but do remember as you're looking through the book, also at the end of the chapter, it talks about the early labor movement. So there'll be a little bit of a push for people to have safer working places, better wages, that kind of stuff, maybe develop a minimum wage. But yeah, that push doesn't go very far during this era. And it really won't be till the 20th century where you see big progress on that. But you will definitely see strikes and things, workplace violence, that sort of stuff. Not like people are mad, but violent strikes, I should say, after the Civil War. But you won't see businesses change or government forcing businesses to change and starting to regulate those businesses until the 20th century. And again, remember, most people don't work in factories during this time period. Most people who live in cities starting to work in factories or workplaces, and other things that it changes that we didn't really talk about. The idea of time. Nobody really cared what time it was before because you didn't have anywhere to go. So you got up when the sun got up, and then you went and worked on your farm and did farm work till the sun went down, and then you went in and ate corn and biscuits or whatever you ate when you lived on the farm. Eggs, a lot of eggs probably because you had chickens. But you worked sun up to sundown, and then, when you're putting in the crops, you worked a lot. When you're harvesting the crops, you worked a lot. In the meantime, you prayed a lot for the crops. But you did factory work or I'm sorry, farm work, and time didn't matter. You didn't clock in, you didn't clock out, you didn't have to be places on time. Once you add factories, going to work, and trains, the idea of being on time starts to matter, because if you have to pick stuff up train, then you have to be there on time. So that's when we start to develop standard time and make sure that everybody's clock is at the same time. And if you have to clock in for work, you have to be on time, and they keep track of your hours. So it really changes our society quite a bit, slowly, not all immediately, but it does lead to some really big changes. And it leads to the beginnings of urbanization, but that process will be slow because the South, we'll just go with that, and the Midwest. There aren't very many big cities in the South or the Midwest for a very long time. All right, I didn't ask you anything at all. I was going to, wasn't I? Let me